Have you ever experienced that after a deep spiritual experience, where you felt a total connection with life, with something greater than yourself, suddenly everything seemed to fade away? It's as if you had touched a luminous truth with the fingertips of your soul, yet when returned to everyday life, everything lost meaning. What once excited you no longer moves you. The goals that motivated you no longer matter. And the most unsettling thing, you don't know why. No one told you that after seeing the truth, you might feel more lost than before. It's not exactly sadness, but it's not joy either. It's a strange silence, as if your soul had paused, as if something inside you stayed contemplating, but without moving. It's a mix of clarity and bewilderment. And if you are experiencing this, I want you to know something very important. You are not alone, and you are far from stuck. You are going to one of the most powerful and most misunderstood phases of the spiritual awakening process. Mario Alonso Puig, a medical surgeon and expert in leadership, neuroscience, and human consciousness, explains it clearly and deeply. Spiritual awakening is not a goal, it is a threshold. It is not the end of a path, but the opening to a much more challenging, yet infinitely more authentic one. And right after that opening comes a stage that very few understand. A stage not seen on social media, not taught in meditation courses, but inevitable. The apparent void, the disorientation, the existential silence. That stage in which you feel you understood everything, and yet don't want to do anything. Where's the motivation? Where's the energy from before? Why? If you are finally awake, do you feel like you're floating in limbo, without direction, without purpose, without will? Sometimes we confuse this process with laziness, apathy, depression, or even a crisis of faith. But it is none of those things. In reality, it is a profound reorganization of your identity, your mind, your body, and your soul. Your entire system is trying to adapt to a new frequency, to a new way of being. You are leaving behind an old self, full of conditioning, expectations, masks, to begin inhabiting a more authentic, quieter, freer self. And here comes something key that Mario reminds us over and over. True change does not come from a mind, but from a soul that decides to see differently. Because this new impulse you're searching for does not arise from logic, duty, or the need for approval. This new motivation originates from a much deeper place, more real, more aligned with your true nature. What you are feeling is not the end of your path. It is a transition. It's as if life is telling you, you no longer need to run. You no longer need to impress. You no longer need to prove anything. Now it's time to inhabit, to remember who you are without needing anyone's validation. And yes, that can be uncomfortable, because no one taught us to stay still in the middle of transformation. We were taught to produce, to advance, to do something. But there are moments when doing less is the bravest act, when not pushing is the most spiritual thing you can do. This video is made to talk about all of that, about that void you don't understand, about that internal collapse that seems to have erased your passion, about that limbo phase where you don't know what to do, about what happens in your body, your mind, and your energy when everything familiar falls apart. But we will also talk about what comes next, about the birth of the authentic self, about how ambition changes when you no longer need recognition, about how motivation stops being something you chase and starts to spring from within, about how it feels to live from the deep self, without anxiety, without demands, without masks, a life that doesn't need a shout to have meaning. All of this we will explore through the clear and human perspective of Mario Alonso Puig, because he doesn't just speak from knowledge but from experience. From years of observing what happens in a human being when they dare to cross the threshold from ego to consciousness. His words illuminate but also accompany. He doesn't idealize the process. He doesn't simplify it. He humanizes it. And that is exactly what you need now. So, if you felt that after your spiritual awakening all that arrived was silence, if you've wondered if this is normal, if it's part of the path, stay. Because you might not be failing. You might not be going backward. You might, for the first time, truly be beginning. Before continuing, I want to invite you to do something important. If this message resonates with you, if at some point in your life you felt your motivation disappear just when you had the most awareness, subscribe now. This channel is for those who no longer settle for empty answers, For those who don't want superficial motivation, but truth. Here we speak from the soul, and if you are here, it's because yours is ready to listen. Let's begin this journey not to give you magical solutions, but so that you discover that the motivation you believe you have lost today has not gone away. It is just taking a new form. It is only waiting for you to let go of the noise so it can be heard again. And everything starts in that silent space that makes you so uncomfortable. Everything begins with that apparent emptiness, which is actually the door to your deepest transformation. We now delve into the first major phase, that puzzling silence that appears just after opening your spiritual eyes. That moment when you feel you saw something very big, but now, inexplicably, everything seems to stop. Let's understand what that emptiness really is, and why. Although it may not seem so, it might be the best thing that has happened to you. Spiritual awakening is, for many people, one of the most impactful moments of their life. Some experience it as a sudden revelation, a clarity that arrives without warning and changes everything. For others, it happens more slowly, like a seed germinating until one day, without knowing how, nothing is the same anymore. Perception changes. The world seems to be seen with different eyes. What once seemed normal now seems absurd. What once hurt you now feels like an opportunity. It's as if, suddenly, you remember something that was always inside you, but that you have forgotten. And upon remembering it, you feel a peace that does not depend on anything external. That instant is powerful. You feel connected. Light, as if your soul had come home. Some people say they feel a kind of unconditional love spreading throughout their body. Others say they see everyone with compassion. Some cry without understanding why, and others laugh without any apparent reason. Everything seems to fit. Life finally makes sense. It is a moment when you feel you have crossed an invisible threshold, and once you cross it, you know you cannot go back. But then something happens that no one explained to you. After that opening, after that spiritual climax, silence comes. And it's not comfortable silence. It's a void, an absence of enthusiasm, a strange sensation, as if everything had stopped, as if everything you had understood suddenly lost its color. You no longer want to talk to anyone. You struggle to connect with the things that once excited you. You don't feel exactly sad, but neither joyful. It's as if life had turned down the volume, and now everything sounds distant. And then you ask yourself, what happened? Isn't it supposed to be that after awakening, I should feel more motivated than ever? Shouldn't I be more inspired, more committed, more alive? This is the deep conflict that many people face silently, because it's not easy to tell the world, I woke up spiritually and now I feel empty. It seems contradictory. It seems like a failure, as if you climbed a mountain only to realize there is no view. But that's not true. What's happening is not a mistake. It is a natural part of the process, a delicate but fundamental phase that deserves to be understood with compassion. Mario Alonso Puig has spoken on multiple occasions about what happens in the brain and psyche when we go through these kinds of processes, and his approach is deeply revealing because he neither romanticizes nor overly spiritualizes what is happening. He explains it from science, from observing the human being in its entirety: body, mind, emotion, spirit. For Puig, one of the most common mistakes when talking about spiritual awakening is believing that by understanding a new truth, everything else immediately aligns. But that is not how it happens. What you understand at the level of consciousness, your body and mind need time to integrate. Imagine you have lived your whole life in a dimly lit room. Suddenly, someone opens a huge window and powerful light floods in, revealing everything. You see the dust on the furniture, the stains on the mirror, the corners you had never looked at. At first, you marvel at the light, but then that same light forces you to see things you didn't want to see. And when you close the window to process what you saw, everything feels darker than before. That is the silence we're talking about. It's not the absence of truth. It's a necessary pause to assimilate it. From Neuroscience, Mario Alonso Puig explains that the human brain is designed for narrative coherence. It needs to tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end. When we experience a spiritual awakening, that narrative breaks. The story we believe to be true about who we are, what we want, what life is, no longer holds. But we don't yet have a new story to replace it. We are between two stories, the old one that no longer serves us, and the new one we don't yet understand. That in-between space is confusing because the brain tries to make sense and cannot find it. So it enters a state some interpret as lack of motivation, but is really internal recalibration. Furthermore, the limbic system, the part of the brain that regulates emotions, tends to associate change with danger, even if the change is positive. Because for the primitive brain, the known is safe, even if painful, and the unknown is uncertain, even if it promises peace. That's why when we spiritually awaken and everything changes, a very ancient part of our nervous system reacts cautiously. It halts the impulse, suspends emotions, reduces enthusiasm, not because something is wrong, but because it needs to process the change at its own pace. At this point, many people become desperate because they expect awakening to bring constant euphoria, to fill them with energy, gratitude, and immediate purpose. But Mario makes it clear, awakening is only the first step. What comes next is the real work, the journey inward, the rebuilding of a life from a different foundation. And that process, at first, can feel like nothing, as if you have lost your spark. But in reality, what you lost was the addiction to what you used to call motivation. Because much of the motivation we held before awakening was noise, goals that were not ours, inherited desires, fears disguised as ambition, demands we confuse with enthusiasm. When all that turns off, the silence that remains is not emptiness. It is available space. Space for a new way of living. But of course, the brain still doesn't know what to do with that space. And so it interprets it as a lack of something, as a loss. It is not a loss. It is a transition. The most important thing here is not to panic. Don't think you are regressing. Don't punish yourself for not feeling motivated. Don't force yourself to go back to the way you were. You don't have to fit back into that previous version of yourself. What you need is to give yourself permission to be here, in this silence, in this intermediate space where, although it may not seem so, something deep is underway. Your motivation has not gone. It has just stopped shouting. And now, to hear it again, you're going to have to do something that scares but frees. Stay still and trust. When someone awakens spiritually, not only does their perception change, their identity changes. And this, although inspiring, is not an easy path, because it involves the hardest thing a human being can be asked to do, to let die the one they believe themselves to be. That version of you that defined itself by what it achieved, by what others thought, by what it had, by what it feared. That I built over the years with pieces of experiences, beliefs, traumas, family mandates, and social conditioning begins to crumble. And that hurts, even if you no longer want it to, even if you know it wasn't authentic, even if you are clear that this character can no longer hold your soul. It hurts to let go, because it's like saying goodbye to an old friend. Even though you knew they were leading you down the wrong path, that identity was your known zone, your reference point, your way of functioning in the world. And now that you're starting to live from a deeper truth, that old self begins to disappear. Mario Alonso Puig expresses it movingly. We cannot access our true greatness while we are identified with the image we created to survive. That phrase contains a powerful truth, because most people don't live from their essence, but from their strategy. And when you awaken, that strategy no longer serves you. It becomes heavy, uncomfortable, empty. That is why motivation disappears, because you can no longer act from the same place. You can no longer use the old engines. You can no longer force yourself to desire what deep down you know was never yours. The symbolic death of the old self is neither quick nor orderly. It is a progressive process, sometimes silent, other times painful, manifesting in all areas. Habits that lose meaning, relationships that weaken, activities that no longer fulfill you. You may even experience some disconnection from your environment, as if you no longer fit. And it's not that the world has changed. It is you who no longer fits in the old narrative. And that, although a sign of evolution, can cause confusion, isolation, and fear. This is where one of the most sensitive systems of the human body comes into play, the autonomic nervous system. Because everything you experience on a spiritual, emotional, or psychological level has a correlate in your biology. We are not just floating consciousness. We are body, and the body is a stage where everything we understand integrates. That is why, when your identity begins to change, your nervous system reacts. And it does so seeking balance, protection, stability. Because as Puig explains well, the body does not understand metaphors, but it does understand threats. When the old self begins to die, the nervous system activates in alert mode, not because there is a real danger, but because there is a loss of control. And for the body, losing control is synonymous with insecurity. So it starts to compensate, lowering energy, suspending impulses, slowing down responses. What you interpret as not feeling like doing anything is sometimes the body saying, I need time to reorganize. The sympathetic nervous system, which activates under stress, may have been overstimulated for years if your old identity was based on constant doing, on demands, on hyperproductivity. And when you let go of that, a kind of temporary disconnection occurs, as if the body didn't know how to function without that pressure. The parasympathetic system, which regulates rest and regeneration, then tries to take over but hasn't yet found a stable pattern. And this creates a hybrid, confusing state of emotional and physical fatigue. Mario Alonso Puig invites us to listen to the body as an ally, not as an obstacle, to stop fighting that feeling of not wanting to do anything, to not label it as laziness or blockage, because often it's not that. It's just the body trying to find a new balance to support your new self. The old operating system is deactivating, and the new one hasn't been fully installed yet. It's a moment of neurological, energetic, and existential transition. And this is where many people make wrong decisions, because instead of honoring that pause, they demand a return to the previous pace. They try to motivate themselves by force. They sign up for courses, make lists, force themselves to produce. But it doesn't work, because motivation cannot arise from the same source that is dying. What you need is not to return to the previous movement, but to allow the necessary rest for a new way of living to emerge. Puig states clearly, only when there is silence can the truth be heard. And that silence, though uncomfortable, is the fertile ground where something new begins to be born. But the body needs to feel safe to allow that process. That's why the first thing we must do in this stage is not seek goals, but generate internal security. Rest, breathing, connection with simplicity, contact with nature, gentle habits. Everything that tells the nervous system, we are okay. You can relax. You don't need to be on alert. You can trust. When you start doing this, something inside you changes. The body stops resisting. The nervous system begins to find a new rhythm. And little by little, without realizing it, motivation returns. But no longer as an urgency or imposition, but as a natural pulse, an invitation from within, not to go back to what you did before, but to create from a new place, more truthful, more aligned with who you really are. The symbolic death of the old self, then, is not a tragedy. It is an initiation. And the rebalancing of the nervous system is not an obstacle, but a symptom that you are leaving behind struggle to enter presence. You are learning to move without fear, to live without masks, to motivate yourself without demand, to act from being, not from obligation. So if you feel empty, tired, directionless, don't interpret it as a sign of failure. Interpret it as what it really is, the sign that you are stopping being who you pretended to be, to begin being who you came to be, and that, although it doesn't feel good at first, is one of the most beautiful things that can happen to you. For much of our lives, we learn to see the ego as a negative figure. It is blamed for our fears, our failures, our need for approval. It is said that the ego prevents us from growing, that it is the root of suffering, that it is an illusion we must eradicate. However, this view is incomplete and, in many cases, unfair, because the ego is not the enemy. The ego has actually been an essential architect in construction of your identity. It has been the organizing system with which you learn to navigate reality, to protect yourself, to position yourself in the world. Mario Alonso Puig makes it clear. The ego is not bad, it is functional. It has a reason for being. It is not there to sabotage you, but to give you structure. The ego is what allows you to say, I am, what gives you a name, a place, a narrative. Without that minimal structure, we cannot function. We cannot communicate, make decisions, or establish boundaries. The ego is what organizes subjective experience. It helps us differentiate ourselves from the environment, to know where we end and the other begins. When we are children, the ego begins to form through the gaze of others. We identify with the opinions we receive, with gestures of approval or rejection. Little by little, we create an internal image of who we are based on what we are told we are. If we are told we are intelligent, we adopt that role. If we are told we are problematic, we also assume it. And over time, that image solidifies. It becomes a character we play without questioning. This character, although often limiting, has served us. It has helped us survive in difficult environments, to adapt to family, social, and educational systems, to belong. And that need for belonging is biological. It is in our DNA. The ego has protected us from rejection. It has given us a narrative that, although imperfect, allowed us to feel we had a place in the world. Therefore, it is not about destroying the ego. It is about recognizing its role without letting it take control of our soul. Because when the ego takes the driver's seat, life becomes a constant comparison, competition, and search for validation. The problem is not having an ego. The problem is living dominated by it. And that is precisely what begins to change when we undergo a spiritual awakening. That structure that once organized our entire inner world begins to crack. It no longer functions the same. The labels we use, profession, family role, achievements, appearance, no longer define us. And that creates a very particular kind of vertigo. Because if I am no longer who I thought I was, then who am I? Here is where the conflict becomes evident. Because while one part of you begins to expand, another part feels threatened. The ego resists losing prominence, not because it is evil, but because it was trained to protect you. And now that you want to move from another place, it goes on alert. It wants to stay in control. It offers you its old tools: pride, fear, control, perfectionism, judgment. It tells you, this is how we survived. Don't change the rules now. But something inside, you can no longer sustain that game. You can no longer pretend. You can no longer keep acting to be loved, to fit in, to meet expectations that don't belong to you. Because the soul, once awake, does not tolerate living under the mandate of the character. It wants to be, not to seem. It wants to express, not to please. Mario Alonso Puig invites us to look at this moment with compassion, to not fight the ego, but to understand it, to converse with it, like with an old friend who has already fulfilled their function. The ego is afraid and its fear is legitimate. For a long time, it believed that if you showed yourself as you were, you would be hurt, rejected, judged. And so it built a safe, albeit limiting, identity. Now that you are ready to live from another place, it fears for you, but it does not need to be eliminated. It only needs to be relocated. Imagine that for years the ego has been driving the car of your life. It has been the one making decisions, steering the direction, choosing the paths. And you were in the passenger seat, giving it instructions based on fear, wounds, and the need for acceptance. Now, after awakening, you realize you want to take the wheel, that you want to go a different way, that you no longer need to please, stand out, compete, that you no longer want to stay on autopilot. And when you tell the ego to move aside, it resists. It feels displaced. It feels like it is losing its function. But the truth is you are not expelling it. You are inviting it to a new relationship with yourself. Because the ego, when it does not lead, can serve. It can organize. It can protect. It can collaborate. It can care for boundaries. But only when it is at the service of the soul, not when it controls it. And that transition, that relocation, does not happen overnight. It is a process. It is an internal negotiation. It is a daily practice of awareness. The important thing is that you begin to identify when the ego is in charge. And you can feel that. When you make decisions out of fear, pressure, or the need to be seen or approved, it is the ego speaking. When you obsess about being right, winning, proving, or controlling, it is the ego driving. And when that happens, you don't need to fight it. You just need to remind yourself that you are not that voice, that there is something deeper, wiser, calmer inside you that can take the helm. Puig insists that true freedom is born when we stop acting out of reaction and start acting out of awareness. And for that, we need to recognize the place the ego occupies while continuing to feed its dominance. It is not about denying it. It is about observing it, thanking it, and little by little, letting go of its leadership. This phase can be very challenging because it directly touches the structure with which we have sustained our life. But it is also the greatest opportunity for transformation, to stop living from image and start living from truth. One of the most common confusions after spiritual awakening is thinking we have lost motivation, that something inside us has gone out forever, that we no longer have the necessary drive to create, advance, or dream, and it is natural to feel that way. In fact, that feeling usually appears right after having gone through a deep understanding of life, an opening of consciousness that seemed to promise more enthusiasm, more clarity, more direction. However, the opposite happens. Enthusiasm dissolves, clarity clouds, and direction becomes blurry. But what is actually happening is much more interesting, because it is not motivation that is falling away. It is the fuel with which you use to move. Alonso Puig helps us see this process from another perspective. He proposes that many times we confuse the true inner drive with a kind of reactive energy born from fear, insecurity, or the need to prove something. And that energy can be powerful, yes. It can push you to achieve things, to conquer goals, to keep busy. But it is not authentic. It is false fuel, a motivation manufactured from wounds, voids, comparisons. It does not come from the soul, but from the ego. When you live from that place, you can seem like a very motivated person. You can be productive, active, even admired. But inside, something does not fit. There's a feeling of weariness, of constant struggle, of dissatisfaction that is not calmed by achievements or applause. Because you are functioning out of a need, not a choice. You are chasing something, but without truly being present on the path. And that, even if the world applauds it, disconnects you from yourself. That is why, when you awaken, that energy begins to disappear. You can no longer force yourself. You can no longer do things because you have to. You can no longer sustain a life built on external expectations. And then, of course, you feel like something is crumbling, that you are no longer efficient, that you lost focus, that you don't feel like doing anything. But what you lost was not focus or desire. You lost the artificial drive that sustained the self you no longer are. This inevitably generates a feeling of emptiness, because for years, your entire system, mental, emotional, physical, operated on that fuel. You were used to living in a hurry, from I have to, from what comes next. And now, that system has collapsed, and you are left with silence. A silence that, at first, does not seem sacred. It seems hollow, uncomfortable, even frightening. That is where the feeling of disconnection appears. You don't know what you want. You don't know where you're going. Even, in many cases, you don't know who you are. The activities that once filled you now bore you. The people you shared with no longer understand you. Your conversations become more introspective, quieter, less urgent. And all of this, if not understood, can be confused with a kind of spiritual depression. But Alonso Puig insists, this is not a fall, it is a transition. What you feel as lack of motivation is actually a cleansing phase. The system is expelling the old drive, that emotional gasoline that came from the ego, and that can no longer keep you going. The soul is seeking a new way to move, and that new way does not impose itself. It reveals itself. Therefore, when you feel disconnected, don't rush to fill the void again. Don't look for another project, another job, another partner, another goal. Don't try to rebuild yourself out of urgency. Stop, look at that void, feel it, acknowledge it, because in that blank space, there is a new language starting to be born. One that does not shout, does not impose, does not need validation. One that can only be heard in silence. The feeling of meaninglessness is also part of this process. Because if your life was organized around external goals, social roles, titles, productivity, when you let go of that, everything seems to lose value. But that does not mean life has lost meaning. It means the previous meaning no longer serves. It was a manufactured, conditioned, borrowed meaning. Now you have to discover your own. one that you cannot explain in words, but that you can feel in your body, in your breath, in small gestures. Mario explains that true meaning is not sought, it is remembered, and to remember it, you need to get rid of everything you are not, of all those ideas that told you that you had to be successful, that you had to meet standards, that you had to be useful, strong, admirable, perfect. All of that is falling away. And in the middle of that fall, silence becomes uncomfortable because you no longer know where to live from. You can no longer force yourself, but you still don't know how to flow. And it is precisely there where the soul begins to take space, where the new begins to germinate. It is a delicate moment, but deeply fertile, because you are learning to move from listening, not from reaction, from authentic desire, not obligation, from love for what you do, not from the need to be someone. You are starting to create from being, not from duty. Of course, at first that does not feel like power. It feels like fragility, like being suspended in the air, not knowing where to land. But it is in that suspension where something inside you begins to mature, to become clearer, lighter, more conscious. That is why, if right now you're going through that silence, that meaninglessness, that disconnection, do not rush. Don't force yourself to return to what you already know you are not. Don't confuse this state with loss. It is a transformation. And like every transformation, it has its own rhythm. Your soul is seeking its true fuel, and it will find it, but only if you allow yourself not to fill the space with urgency. Trust, you are not broken. You are on pause, a pause that is not passivity, but preparation, because after emptying yourself of all the false, the only thing that can be born is the true. Now then, there's a silent stage in the awakening journey that is rarely mentioned clearly. It is not glamorous, it is not exciting, it does not seem evolutionary in appearance, but it is, in reality, one of the most significant. It is a strange, ambiguous moment that many people describe as if they were floating in an intermediate place. They are not at the same point where they started, but they also don't feel they have reached a new destination. They are not completely asleep, but not fully awake either. They are not bad, but not good either. It is like inhabiting a pause, a suspended space where there are no certainties, no clear goals, no urgencies that seem real. Mario Alonso Puig has named this type of state as territories of transformation. And although on the outside it may seem that nothing is happening, inside the deepest foundations of the self are being reorganized. But from the surface, from everyday experience, what is experienced is something much more bewildering. The feeling of being neither in the past nor in the future. It is as if time stood still. As if the story of your life entered a strange interval where you can no longer do what you used to, but you don't know what to do now. This space feels like a limbo, and it is because you have let go of an identity, though not completely, but you have not yet embodied a new one. You have stopped seeking what you used to believe you needed, but you don't know where to direct your energy now. You are between two internal dimensions, between two versions of yourself, between two frequencies. And that in-between place is, for many people, desperate. Here the great conflict appears. You want to move forward, but you can't. You want to feel motivated, but you don't. You want clarity, but there is only fog. And that, when not understood, is experienced with frustration, with guilt, with anxiety. Because everything in our culture has taught us that we must have goals, that we must act, that we must be productive, that there's always something to do, to achieve, to improve. But at this point in the spiritual process, none of those formulas work. The only thing left is the pause. A pause that is not chosen, but necessary. Many people, upon reaching the stage, believe something is wrong, that they made a mistake, that they did something wrong during their awakening process, or that they simply were not prepared for the truth. But in reality, there is no error. This stage is part of the natural process of internal reorganization. Only it is not seen, cannot be measured, cannot be easily explained. And that is why it is confused with stagnation, loss, apathy. Mario Alonso Puig insists that the human being is not an action machine, but a living system in constant renewal. And in every renewal, there is a moment of silence. The same happens in nature. Between the end of autumn and the beginning of spring, there is winter, a period where nothing blooms, where the earth seems asleep. But it is not. It is gestating, nourishing itself, preparing the ground for the new. So it also happens with the soul. After the collapse of an old identity, the new one does not appear immediately. There is a time of emptiness, containment, waiting, and that time is not unproductive. Although it is not seen from outside, it is a deeply biological, spiritual, and psycho-emotional process. The body needs time to adapt to new frequencies. The mind needs to release old thought patterns. The emotions need to stabilize. All this requires energy, but not energy to move outward, rather to hold steady within. The complexity lies in the fact that, from our rational education, this stage is experienced as a threat, because there is no clarity, no answers, no structure. And so, the nervous system enters a kind of basal tension, a mixture of mild alertness and deep fatigue, a feeling of I should be doing something, combined with I can't do anything. And that tension manifests in the body as tiredness, insomnia, internal agitation, or simply a feeling of being disconnected from everything. But Mario reminds us that this is not a state of weakness. It is a state of deep transformation. Only the process of transforming does not resemble producing. It doesn't have a linear form. It doesn't follow predictable logic. It's more like a silent alchemy, an internal digestion of everything we previously held, to give way to a new way of living. In this phase, the impulse to get out of the state can be very strong, to seek answers, to seek solutions, to return to the known. But none of that will work, because this limbo is not designed to be avoided. It is designed to be inhabited. And only by inhabiting it can it fulfill its function, which is to empty you of what you are not, to strip you, to dissolve what you no longer need. And only in that spiritual nakedness can a deeper truth begin to emerge. It is important to understand that this process also has biological roots. Puig explains that when we let go of old thought structures, we are also reconfiguring neural connections. The brain needs time to stop operating with the old circuits and start building new ones. And during that transition, there is a period of instability, like when you update the operating system of a device. During installation, the device does not respond. It seems like it is doing nothing, but it is working. The same happens to you. You are installing a new system of perception, a new way of understanding life. But while that is happening, you cannot force the previous functioning. You cannot keep operating as before, because your soul no longer allows it, and your body doesn't either. It resists, stops you, shuts you down, not because you are ill, but because you are entering a higher synchrony, a synchrony that cannot be rushed. At this point, the mind wants to intervene. It wants to understand. It wants to accelerate. But the mind does not have the map, because this territory is not mental. It is existential. And that is the hardest thing for many people, to accept that there is nothing to do but allow, that there is no plan, no scheme, no recipe, that the only thing you can do is stay present, in the now, in the body, in the breath, in the small things. The sacred pause, as Puig calls it, is not a punishment. It is medicine, although at first it may taste bitter, because it forces you to let go of control, to not know, to have no certainties. And in that surrender, in that apparent failure of the self that wants to advance, the true movement begins to reveal itself, one that does not come from the mind but from the soul, one that does not seek goals but coherence, that does not rely on hurry but on truth. And that movement is not announced with fireworks. It feels like a whisper, like an internal direction that has no form yet, but is starting to make itself known only when you stop. One of the most harmful beliefs we carry is the idea that if we are not moving forward, we are failing. We live conditioned by speed, by constant doing, by the logic of performance. And when we enter a stage of pause, like the one that occurs after a spiritual awakening, the mind, trained to measure everything in terms of achievements, concludes a worst. I'm stuck. But that conclusion is not true. You are not stuck. You are integrating. You are allowing everything you have lived, understood, felt, to descend from the mind to the deepest part of you. And that process is not immediate. It is not visible from the outside. And it doesn't have to be, because not everything that transforms is noticeable at first glance. There are changes that only register in the soul, in the internal rhythm, in the way you breathe. Look, listen. Mario Alonso Puig speaks of this stage as a slow but powerful alchemy, a process where consciousness is no longer running after life, but gathering what really matters, where the self, instead of trying to conquer the world, begins to return home, to the body, to the present, to the essential. And of course, that change of direction confuses, because the world keeps telling you, do more, but your soul is telling you, stay. Integrating means making space inside you for what you intellectually understood. It means that intuition you had, that vision that touched you, that new way of seeing things, does not remain just a beautiful idea or an emotional moment, but becomes part of your being, of your way of living, of your way of being in the world. And that is only achieved in the pause. You are not lost. You are not blocked. You are not going backward. You are digesting. You are maturing internally. You are moving from concept to experience, from knowledge to body, from thought to conscious action. But for that to happen, you need time without pressure, time without demands, time for your new internal system to settle. This moment requires a quality we don't usually practice, honoring the state we are in without wanting to change it. And that may seem useless, but it is one of the healthiest gestures you can make. Because every time you try to force an exit, every time you demand yourself to get your motivation back, every time you try to be who you were before, you are interrupting the integration process. Mario makes it clear, the soul needs silence to speak, and the body needs calm to adapt. It's not about giving up in the sense of surrendering, but surrendering in the deepest sense, trusting that the space of non-action also has a purpose that you may not see clearly now, but that will reveal itself later. How do you honor this state? First, by accepting it, truly, not as a decorative thought, but as an inner practice, telling yourself, I am where I need to be. I don't need to speed up. I don't need to find answers right now. That acceptance is like opening windows for fresh air. It takes off pressure. It relaxes the nervous system, and it allows what is unfolding to continue without interruptions. Second, by cultivating presence without goals. This may seem useless to a logical mind, but it is deeply nourishing to the soul. Being silent, walking without direction, breathing consciously, cooking attentively, listening without responding, being with the simple. All that feeds the integration process, because what you are living does not complete with more information. It completes with embodiment, with direct experience, with stillness. Third, by taking care of the body. Mario Alonso Puig insists on this. The body is not a spiritual obstacle. It is the instrument of your evolution. If you are in an inner pause stage, your body needs rest, hydration, gentle movement, natural light, contact with the earth, spaces of tenderness. You don't need extreme training or forced habits. You need listening. You need to ask yourself, what would do me good today? And allow yourself to answer without judgment. Fourth, by letting go of the need to understand everything now. Integration doesn't happen with immediate mental clarity. Sometimes we spend weeks, even months, in this state without knowing what is happening. And suddenly one day, something clicks. A word resonates. A gesture makes sense. A certainty appears without being sought. That's a sign that the new is settled. But for that to happen, you need to hold the not knowing, the uncertainty, the apparent nothingness. Honoring this stage also means stopping comparing yourself to others, because what for others is productivity, for you now may be breathing. What for others is expansion, for you may be silence. You are on another frequency, another rhythm, another type of maturation. You are not behind. You are within, and that is as valid as any visible achievement. When you can look at your pause as a sacred space, everything will change. You will no longer feel trapped, but protected. You will no longer feel like you are wasting time, but gaining depth. You will no longer see silence as punishment, but as opportunity, because it is there, in that space of apparent stillness, where something different begins to form, something that is not built from effort, but from authenticity. Mario says that when a person learns to respect their internal rhythm, they begin to reconnect with their true power. Not the power of doing without rest, but the power of being present, of feeling, of deciding consciously. And that can only be born in the void, in the rest, in the space where urgency has surrendered. So if you are in that limbo, if you feel stopped, disconnected, without answers, do this small act of inner revolution. Don't run away. Stay, breathe, look around, and realize that nothing is missing, that you don't have to run, that you don't have to prove anything, that you can simply be, because right now that is the wisest, bravest, and most sacred thing you can do. If you have ever felt trapped in that silence after awakening, without understanding why you no longer wanted to run or chase goals, tell me in the comments. Right? I am on pause but still awake. That way I'll know you are not alone in this process, and together we can support each other with more compassion. There's a moment in the awakening process when, without realizing it, you start to stop acting for others. You begin to let go of the need to please, to impress, to be validated. You no longer want to compete. You no longer want to prove yourself. You no longer need to run to meet standards that were never yours. Something inside you gets tired, but it is not physical tiredness. It is like a deep sigh of the soul saying, I can no longer hold this. And it's not about resignation. It's not apathy. It is rather a silent lucidity that shows you that so much effort to appear as someone took you away from who you really were. Then you realize that the armor weighs more than the wound, that the mask you wore to be accepted has become more limiting than the criticisms you feared, that the character you played no longer makes sense in this new stage. It's as if your whole life you've been pushing a door to go out, and suddenly you discover it was always open inward. And there, in that moment when you can no longer pretend, an inevitable question arises. Who am I if I no longer want to pretend? If I no longer want to please? If I no longer have anything to prove? If I am no longer running after someone else's model of success? What remains when all that falls away? That question has no immediate answer, because for years, even decades, we had confused our essence with the character we learned to play. We were taught that we were our achievements, our skills, our titles, our appearance, our emotional control. And now, in this new stage, all of that blurs. You can no longer hold on to those old structures, but you also don't yet know what to lean on. It's as if you have let go of one identity without yet having another to replace it. This is one of the deepest and at the same time most vulnerable moments of the path, the birth of the authentic self. And like any birth, it involves a crossing, a leaving of a known womb toward a new reality, without a manual, without guarantees, without protections. Being born as an adult is very different from being born as a baby, because now you know what you are leaving behind. You know what you lose by being yourself, and that requires courage. Mario Alonso Puig speaks of this process with moving depth. He says that true suffering does not arise from what happens to us, but from the distance between who we are and who we show. And when that gap shortens, when the inner and outer begin to align, an extraordinary phenomenon occurs. Peace begins to settle without reason, not because everything is resolved, but because you are closer to your truth. Living from the center, as Puig proposes, is not withdrawing from the world. It is not giving up goals or relationships. It is ceasing to build your worth based on what happens outside. It is living from that intimate and deep core where what you think, what you feel, and what you do are in coherence. You no longer betray yourself. You no longer negotiate the essential. You no longer use your energy to maintain an image. You use it to inhabit yourself. But to get there, first you have to empty yourself of all that you are not. And that is not always pleasant, because it involves letting go of roles that gave you identity, even if they were painful. Sometimes you were the strong one, the one who always could, the one who didn't cry. Or maybe you were the successful one, the one who always moved forward. Or the caregiver, the indispensable one, the one who solved everything. And now that all of that is beginning to fall, you feel an inner vertigo, because those labels, as limiting as they were, gave you a place. But the soul does not want to assign places. It wants freedom. It wants truth. And truth does not need to be explained. It only needs to be lived. When you begin to allow the authentic self to emerge, subtle but transformative things happen. Your conversations change. You become more honest, quieter, more present. You stop responding automatically. You observe more. You accept more. Not because you lack character, but because you no longer need to be right all the time. Not because you are weak, but because you understand that not everything needs to be defended. And here is where something new begins to be born. No longer based on speed, but on presence. No longer driven by fear, but by clarity. No longer directed by the character, but from the center, from that internal space where you know who you are, not because you read it, but because you feel it. Puig reminds us that when a person lives from their center, they do not feel superior or inferior. They feel at peace, because they are no longer playing at appearing. They are no longer forcing an idealized version of themselves. They are no longer trying to fit in. They are being. And being, although it seems simple, is the greatest act of inner power there is. Of course, this process does not happen overnight. It is not a sudden illumination. It is a daily practice, a constant decision to return to the center when you stray, to recognize when you are acting from a mask, and to return gently to the real face, not to judge yourself, but to accompany yourself with love. And it is in that loving repetition where the authentic self begins to strengthen. It begins to expand. It begins to take up space, not as a shout, but as a presence. It does not need to impose itself. It only needs to be sustained. And you are the one who must sustain it. Sometimes, living from the authentic self will mean disappointing others, because you will no longer please as before. You will no longer lie to yourself to avoid making anyone uncomfortable. You will no longer follow conversations that do not nourish you. You will no longer accept jobs, relationships, or situations that drain you, and that, from the outside, may seem selfish. But it is not. It is matured self-love. It is integrity. It is respect for your soul. And although at first that hurts, over time it becomes your way of breathing, of walking, of viewing life. Because when you live from the center, what you value most is not how others see you, but how you feel about yourself. One of the most impactful revelations after spiritual awakening is understanding that you don't need to seek motivation to live from the authentic self, not because there is no inner movement, but because that movement arises from a place completely different from what you were used to. You are no longer driven by the desire to achieve something to be someone, but by the deep need to be you, with truth, with simplicity, with integrity. And that changes everything. Alonso Puig explains it clearly. The soul does not move by external motivation. It moves by internal coherence. It does not need stimuli. It does not need promises. It does not need rewards. What truly keeps you going when you live from your center is the harmony between what you feel, what you think, and what you do. It is the inner silence that appears when your actions do not contradict your truth. It is the relief of not betraying yourself. It is the calm of ceasing to perform. From that coherence arises a different kind of energy. It is not intense euphoria nor constant pressure. It is a gentle, steady force that supports you even when everything around you seems uncertain. You don't have to get up every day searching for motivation to do what you do. You do it because what you do represents you, because it is congruent with you, because it allows you to be at peace beyond the outcome. That is why the authentic self does not ask, "What must I do to achieve success?" It asks, "What can I do today to stay close to myself?" Action is no longer driven by demand, but by attunement. And although from the outside it may seem less productive, less ambitious, less explosive, in reality, it is much more powerful because it is sustainable, because it does not depend on approval, applause, or meeting expectations. It depends only on you. But reaching that point does not happen automatically. After undoing the character, a complex space comes, the reunion with the center. And reuniting with yourself does not mean going back to who you were before. It means, rather, learning to inhabit yourself for the first time without decorations, without adornments, without walls, without armor. That process requires courage, but also great delicacy. The first thing you need to reunite with your center is to listen to your body, because the body always knew who you were. While the mind constructed identities, the body recorded the truth. When you pretended, the body tensed. When you acted out of obligation, it tired. When you forced yourself to belong, it lost energy. The body has been a silent witness to all your disconnections, but it is also the most direct channel back to yourself. Alonso Puig, as a physician and scholar of the mind-body connection, constantly asserts, coherence manifests physically. When you live in your center, you breathe differently. Your digestion improves. Your muscles relax. Your nervous system stabilizes. It's not magic, it's biology. The body celebrates when you finally stop forcing it to sustain an identity that isn't yours. That is why returning to your center involves small gestures, eating mindfully, moving with respect, sleeping without guilt, touching the earth, breathing deeply. Not because that fixes something, but because it reminds you that you are here, and being here is already enough. The second thing you need is emotional listening. That is, stopping judging what you feel. Often, after letting go of the character, emotions appear that you previously repressed. Sadness, anger, fear, tenderness, desire, emptiness. And if you are not prepared, you might want to hide, control, or deny them. But reuniting with your center means letting those emotions pass through you like waves, not allowing them to define you, but not rejecting them either. Coherence is not perfection. It is not feeling only elevated things. It is allowing yourself to feel what you truly feel without masks. It is giving yourself permission to be silent, to cry without explanation, to laugh without justification, to say, I don't know, without guilt. It is understanding that every emotion has something to show you, not to dominate you, but to return you to yourself. The third is returning to the present. The character always lived in the past, repeating what was, or in the future, fearing what will come. But you, from your center, can only inhabit the now, because authenticity has no archive, no plan, no justification. It only has presence, and that requires practice. It requires choosing to be here, even when the mind wants to run. It requires ceasing to use thought as a refuge and returning to the moment as home. Mario constantly invites us to cultivate that tension-free presence, not to force ideal states, but simply to be aware of where we truly are. And that act, which seems small, is profoundly revolutionary, because a person who inhabits the present no longer needs to control everything, no longer lives reacting, no longer survives. Gradually, they begin to live. And fourth, and perhaps most importantly, is to create from authenticity. It doesn't matter if your expression is art, words, service, care, science, or silence. What matters is that what you do carries your true energy, that you don't do it to appear but to share, that you don't do it to convince but to express. Because when you create from the center, you not only transform yourself, you transform the space you inhabit. Reconnecting with your center doesn't mean you stop doubting, nor that you have everything clear, nor that you never feel fear again. It means that, even with fear, you choose not to betray yourself. That, even in uncertainty, you decide to be faithful to yourself. And that, even when the world pressures you to return to your old version, you gently choose to stay where you know you are yourself. And there, in that daily act of coherence, true peace is born. Not an ideal peace, without conflicts, without noise, without challenges, but a peace lived from within. A peace that does not depend on what happens outside. A peace that does not need to be explained, because it is simply felt. So if you are in that process of letting go of the character and starting to live from the center, don't worry about not feeling motivated. Seek coherence, not artificial energy. Ask yourself every day, does this represent me? Does this do me good? Is this aligned with who I really am now? And if the answer is yes, keep going there, even if you don't know where it leads, even if it still has no shape, even if no one understands. Because the path of the authentic self is not walked with certainties, it is walked with presence. And with every coherent step, something inside you begins to bloom. For years, perhaps even decades, your drive to move forward was clear. There were goals, there were objectives, there were planned paths. You wanted to achieve things, meet expectations, overcome challenges, and all that gave you direction. It was like a lit flame pushing you forward. In many cases, that motivation disguised itself as enthusiasm, commitment, responsibility. And surely it helped you build many things: relationships, titles, projects, structures that supported you during an important stage of your life. But now something has changed. It's no longer the same. The goals that once filled you no longer carry the same weight. The achievements that drove you no longer excite you. The tasks that once activated you now leave you indifferent. And that unsettles you, because it seems the spark is gone, as if something inside you broke, as if you lost your north. And the most disconcerting thing is that you don't know if this is evolution or being lost. You don't know if you're maturing spiritually or simply drifting without direction, because from the outside, what you feel might look like lack of motivation. But from the inside, what's really happening is something else, a deep transformation of ambition. Mario Alonso Puig explains it clearly. He says that many times, the energy that drives us to do, grow, and achieve does not come from a conscious place, but from an unresolved lack, from a void we have tried to fill with recognition, productivity, belonging, and that, although functional in the short term, does not really lead us to feel at peace. On the contrary, it pushes us into a constant demand cycle that takes us further and further from our center. That is why, when an authentic spiritual awakening happens, one of the first things to collapse is that form of ambition, because the soul no longer wants to get. It wants to understand. It no longer wants to accumulate. It wants to let go. It no longer wants to compete. It wants to connect. And that transition, although deeply liberating, can also be unsettling on the surface, because we are not used to living without an external goal, without an ideal to chase, without a standard to reach. Here the conflict arises. Is this inner calm a sign of spiritual maturity or a sign that I have no purpose anymore? Am I advancing toward a new, more coherent stage, or am I simply losing the ability to dream? Am I ceasing to desire out of wisdom, or because something inside me is shut down? These are legitimate questions. Questions that can hurt, because no one prepared you for this kind of transition. Everything in our culture is designed to keep you wanting something, to never stop, to always have a next step, a new achievement, a pending validation. And when you step out of that logic, even for spiritual reasons, you start feeling out of place. Mario invites us to see this moment not as a loss, but as a shift of axis. What is undoing is not your purpose, but the way you had built your idea of purpose. Before, your identity was strongly tied to your results, to what you did, to what you could show, to what you could achieve. And now, your soul asks you for something simpler but more essential, to be present in what you do without needing it to define you. It is a radical turn, because you no longer do things to be someone. You do them because you are someone, and that difference changes the entire experience. Before, every achievement was a ladder, every step a measure, every recognition a confirmation that you were worthy. Now, every gesture becomes an expression, a way to share, an opportunity to inhabit yourself with more truth. But that does not mean the process doesn't hurt, because abandoning ambition as you knew it is not easy. It requires mourning. It requires letting go of success narratives. It requires stopping comparing yourself. It requires accepting that you may no longer identify with the person you were, the one who moved with haste, intensity, absolute focus, and now simply no longer has that engine. The good news is that what is being born in its place is not apathy. It is space. Space for a new form of impulse. One that does not push, but accompanies. One that does not demand, but inspires. One that does not drive you forward out of fear of falling behind, but invites you to move from within, without violence, without urgency, without the need to prove anything. This new stage feels slower, more intimate, more silent, because what you are looking for is no longer outside. It is inside. You no longer want recognition. You want depth. You no longer want abstract goals. You want real experiences. You no longer want to go further. You want to inhabit yourself better. And that is, in Puig's words, moving from external ambition to internal expansion. An expansion that is not measured in meters traveled or applause received, but in peace, in balance, in authenticity. An expansion that is not seen, but felt, that is not publicly celebrated, but transforms every corner of your life. That is why, if today you feel without the impulse to keep running after what used to move you, don't be scared. Maybe you are not losing your way. Maybe you are finding a new direction, one that doesn't have a name yet, but aligns with who you truly are, one that doesn't seek goals, but meaning, one that doesn't demand you be more, but allows you to be you. And from there, from that new perspective, everything begins to reorganize, not from obligation, but from deep desire, not from the pushing emptiness, but from the expressing fullness. And even if you don't feel it clearly now, even if there is confusion, doubt, or moments of silence, inside you a new way of moving through life is already gestating. Freer, more conscious, more true. When you go through a deep spiritual transformation, you don't stop wanting to do things. You don't stop having ideas, feeling the call to express yourself, imagining possible paths. What changes is not the desire to create, but from where you do it. What transforms is the root, the intention, the energy from which your action arises. You no longer want to move out of fear of falling behind. You no longer need to produce to feel you exist. You no longer do things to justify your presence in the world. You begin to do them because something inside you want to come out, not to impress, but to share. Alonso Puig says it clearly. Creating is not a superficial act nor a luxury, but a necessity of the human soul when it begins to reclaim its truth. The problem is that for years we have created from effort, from comparison, from obligation. We have lived trapped in a logic of constant achievement. And when awakening strips us of that logic, it seems the desire goes out. But it's not like that. The path is just being cleared. The channel is being cleared for creation to arise in another way. From the center, not from the character. Creating from another place means, above all, that you no longer demand of yourself, that you no longer force yourself, that you no longer need a goal to start. You start when there is something real that needs to be born, and you do it even if it's not seen, even if it's not applauded, even if it doesn't bring immediate results, because it is no longer about succeeding. It is about expressing yourself without betraying yourself, about shaping the soul, about giving life to what lives inside you. And the curious thing is that when you create from that space, more silent, deeper, more honest, everything takes on a different texture. There is no urgency. There is presence. There is no strategy. There is rhythm. There is no pressure. There is purpose, not a purpose imposed by a system, but one that emanates from your expanded consciousness, a purpose that cannot be defined with words, but that guides your steps like a soft certainty that vibrates in your chest. That inner change transforms you completely, because now you can write, speak, teach, care, build, or simply be without needing to justify yourself. Because everything you do is aligned with who you are. You are no longer chasing something missing. You are sharing something that is already whole. And that liberates. It liberates from judgment, from outcome, from self-demand. It liberates from the mental noise that always asked, will this be enough? When you create from this new place, you do it just because you feel it, because it arises from within you, because it lights you up inside, even if you don't finish it, even if you don't publish it, even if no one sees it, because the act itself is already complete. It already transforms you. It already brings you back to yourself. And that, at this stage of the journey, is much more valuable than any external recognition. This is where a new kind of impulse arises, a force that no longer comes from fear, but from the heart. Because yes, fear can be a great motivator, but it is a motivator that exhausts, that pushes, that pressures, that conditions. And for a long time, that was your fuel. Fear of not being enough, fear of rejection, fear of losing opportunities, fear of not standing out. But now, from this new awareness, that engine no longer serves you. You no longer tolerate it. It no longer supports you. It drains you. And it is in that emptiness that another kind of impulse begins to be felt. One more silent, lighter, more subtle. It does not push. It attracts. It does not command. It invites. It does not demand. It inspires. It is the impulse born from the heart when you are in tune with your truth, when you are at peace with your process, when you trust enough not to force yourself to be someone you are not. This impulse does not always feel like a burst of energy. Sometimes it is just an idea that appears clearly, or an internal need to move without logical explanation, or the desire to share something small but real. It is a whisper, not a shout. And that is why, at first, it can be difficult to trust it, because you are used to stronger, more visible, noisier engines. But if you give yourself the chance to follow it, you will see that it takes you exactly where you need to be. Mario calls it living with meaning, not with tension, because the soul doesn't need to push you when you are aligned. It doesn't demand speed. It doesn't compare you to anyone. It only asks that you be loyal to what you feel, that you trust the internal pulse, that you act from calm, because when you do that, every step is coherent. And when there is coherence, something that cannot be fabricated appears. Peace. So, it's not that you no longer have ambition. It's that your ambition has become deeper. It is no longer oriented to results. It is oriented to connection. It no longer wants to reach empty goals. It wants to create soulful experiences. It no longer wants to stand out. It wants to leave a mark that doesn't need to be seen to be real, a mark that remains in your body, in your consciousness, in the environment you touch when you live from the heart. And all this does not mean you stop acting, projecting, building. On the contrary, it means you do it with another energy, that you are no longer filled with anxiety to arrive, that you no longer let urgency drag you, that you can work without inner violence, that you can move forward without sacrificing yourself, that you can move without leaving yourself behind. This kind of impulse does not consume you. It does not exhaust you, because it comes from the center, not from lack, because it is not based on fear but on love, because it seeks nothing outside but starts from what is already inside. And when you start living like this, you realize you don't need to do much to feel fulfilled, that you don't need great feats, that you don't need to prove anything. You only need to be coherent with that silent fire that now guides your steps. So if today you feel that your way of creating is changing, that you can no longer work as before, that what once excited you no longer motivates you, don't blame yourself. You are going through a deep reconfiguration. You are learning to move with another consciousness. You are letting go of an engine that no longer resonates with you to be guided by something more real. And that, although disconcerting at first, is one of the greatest signs of inner evolution. Because when the heart leads, life organizes itself. At a certain point in the path of inner transformation, the question is no longer what should I do, but from where am I doing what I do? Because it becomes evident that it is not just about doing for the sake of doing, filling agendas or accumulating tasks. It is about doing from a space that makes sense, that is true, that is coherent with who you are today, not with who you were or who others expect you to be. And that change is profound, because for a long time, action was your refuge. Doing saved you from emptiness, boredom, the discomfort of being with yourself. Doing gave you structure, identity, a sense of value. But now, after awakening, that kind of doing no longer satisfies you. You can no longer act automatically. You can no longer fill your time with activities that don't arise from the soul. You can no longer keep functioning out of duty if that duty does not resonate with your truth. Mario Alonso Puig talks about this transition as the shift from reactive doing to conscious doing, from moving out of obligation to moving out of choice, from producing to survive to creating to express yourself. And this change is not only mental, it is biological, because when the soul takes command, the body knows it. It relaxes, it aligns, it stops fighting against time and begins to synchronize with the present. But this new way of living presents a very real conflict. How to sustain yourself in a society that taught you to depend on external validation. How to live from being when the world continues demanding that you define yourself by what you do, what you achieve, how you look. How not to fall into guilt when you decide to do less, but with more meaning. Here, many face the paradox of awakening. because internally, you feel the call to a simpler, more honest, more authentic life. But externally, everything still revolves around visible success, recognition, performance. And then doubts arise. Am I losing ambition? Am I being irresponsible? Am I disconnecting from the world or finally connected with myself? It is a silent struggle because you can no longer lie to yourself. You can no longer pretend motivation when there is exhaustion. You can no longer say yes when the body screams no. You can no longer participate in conversations where superficiality is celebrated if you are seeking depth. But you also don't quite know how to hold this new truth without feeling strange, out of sync, out of place. Mario states this very clearly. Living from the deep self is not withdrawing from the world. It is inhabiting it with another consciousness. It is not renouncing the external, but ceasing to need it to validate your existence. It is not stopping doing, but doing from another place. And that other place is the body. Yes, the body. Because although we've been educated to seek spirituality away from the physical, the truth is that the body is the soul's most sensitive antenna. It is the instrument with which we embody what we believe. It is the stage where our coherence or incoherence expresses itself. And when we begin to live from being, the body becomes our main guide. Puig insists, the body never lies. It can endure a lot, yes. It can adapt to extreme routines, absurd demands, frantic rhythms. But it never lies. It always gives signals. It always reflects whether you are aligned or not. Through sleep, appetite, tension, breathing, the digestive system, the immune system. Everything in the body is information. Everything in the body is speaking if you know how to listen. That is why a life lived from the deep self involves a different relationship with the body. You no longer see it as a tool to perform, nor as an appearance you must control, nor as an obstacle you must force. You see it as a compass, as a mirror, as a channel. Because when you are well with yourself, your body expresses it. And when you're denying your truth, your body expresses that too. This intimate bond between body and soul is what allows doing to make sense. Because you no longer do things due to external pressure, but because your body supports them gladly. Because you feel energy, pleasure, connection. And when it isn't like that, when your body tenses, shuts down, exhausts itself, you know something's gone off track. That you are returning to persona. That you are acting from habit, not presence. And here a new practice emerges. Learning to pause before deciding. Asking yourself from the body, does this expand me or contract me? Does this nourish me or drain me? Does this bring me closer or push me away from myself? And in that listening, true wisdom begins to bloom, because the soul through the body is always guiding you. Only in the rush of constant doing, you could never hear it clearly. Living from the deep self also means retraining the mind, because the mind is trained to seek validation. It wants to know it is doing the right thing. It wants to confirm that its new way of living is still accepted, recognized, validated by others. But when you start moving from being, you can no longer expect that approval, because often it will not come. What you do may not fit what others expect. It may not be understood. It may even cause discomfort. And that is where you have to stand firm. Puig reminds us that freedom isn't doing whatever you want, but being who you are even if you don't fit in. Holding your truth calmly. Following your path even without applause. Trusting that your soul knows more than any external trend. And when you manage to live like this, from the root and not from reaction, something inside you stabilizes. Because you are no longer at the mercy of others' eyes. You no longer live wondering if what you do pleases, impresses, or impacts. You live wondering if what you do resonates with you. And that, though it seems simple, changes everything. Because now you can choose. You can say no. You can pause. You can wait. You can simplify. You can prioritize. You no longer define yourself by your schedule. You define yourself by your energy, by your presence, by your ability to inhabit what you do without betraying yourself. And although that is not always understood, it is deeply transformative. So if you are at this stage, if you can no longer act like before, if you feel your body's asking for another way of living, if your soul demands coherence, even if the world demands performance, you are in the right place. You are descending from the mind to the being. You are remembering that you did not come to do things to be valuable. You came to be, and from there, to do what truly represents you. And if you manage to hold yourself in that center, even if everything around you keeps spinning, you will know you are finally home. When you stop moving for validation, recognition, or fear, you find yourself in new territory. One where at first it seems there is no impulse at all, as if everything has stopped. But if you have the patience to stay, if you don't rush back to the old dynamics, something extraordinary begins to reveal itself. New engines appear. Energies you hadn't recognized before because they were hidden beneath layers of demand and need. Energies that don't push you, but invite you, that don't hurry you, but ignite you from within. One of those engines is inspiration. And it's not about spectacular, noisy, or overwhelming inspiration. It's more like a subtle vibration, a clarity that comes unexpectedly, a thought that settles on its own, an image that appears in the silence, a gentle certainty that arises when you are aligned. Mario Alonso Puig reminds us that inspiration is not forced, it is allowed. It is not generated from logic, but from availability. And only when you slow down, when you release urgency, can inspiration find you. That inspiration becomes a guide. It shows you the yes without needing great reasons. It gives you clues, not explanations. But if you trust it, it begins to set your rhythm. You start to feel which conversations deserve your energy, which ideas are worth exploring, which steps bring you closer to yourself. And even if you don't always have total clarity, there is an inner compass that begins to turn with more precision, and that at this stage of the deep self is everything. Another engine that emerges strongly is service, but not service understood as sacrifice or self-abandonment, not that model of giving until you are exhausted, so celebrated and so toxic. Here service is something else, giving from fullness, not from need, sharing who you are, not what you've left over, offering your presence, your voice, your listening, your experience from a real place, without agenda, without hidden intention, without wanting to be anyone's savior. When you serve from the deep self, you discover something surprising. You also nourish yourself. You also heal by accompanying. You also grow when you hold the other, without losing yourself in them, because you no longer give to feel valuable. You give because you know you are valuable. And that difference changes everything, because now you can set boundaries without guilt. You can say enough without shutting down. You can care for the other without neglecting yourself. Mario expresses it with precise clarity. There is no greater strength than that of a person who gives without ceasing to inhabit themselves, because from there arises the true act of love, not the one lost in the other, but the one that expands with the other. And when you discover you can live like this, meaning returns, energy returns, not like before, not in bursts, but as a steady flame that sustains you every day. And alongside inspiration and service, another key driver also emerges: authenticity, that feeling of no longer having to strive to be accepted, of being able to show yourself as you are, of not fearing rejection because, even though it might hurt, you know that betraying yourself hurts more. Authenticity is what keeps the deep self alive. It is what allows your relationships to become true, that your voice sounds different, that your choices have roots. When you are authentic, the world no longer controls you, because you're no longer trying to fit in, but to connect. You are no longer operating based on others' expectations, but on your own vibration. And that, although it may take you out of certain spaces, opens doors to others that are more honest, warmer, more human. Spaces where you don't have to pretend anything, where you can breathe effortlessly, where you can simply be. And then in the midst of that new way of living, something unexpected happens. You reconnect with the senses, with simplicity, with what once seemed small. You begin to enjoy a cup of tea without watching the clock, a conversation without needing to be right, a walk without headphones, the texture of water in your hands, the smell of toasted bread, the silence between two sentences. Mario Alonso Puig insists that the body is the most direct path back to the real, because the body is in the present. It cannot pretend. It does not project. It only feels. It only receives. It only inhabits. And when you begin to pay attention to it, you discover that joy is available all the time. Not explosive joy, but gentle joy. The joy of being here. The joy of not having to be somewhere else. The joy of not having to impress anyone. The joy of breathing without hurry, of feeling without judgment, of existing without noise. Stillness also becomes a companion, not as punishment or forced pause, but as a natural refuge. You discover that you don't need constant stimuli, that you can be with yourself without getting bored, that you can look out the window and feel whole, that you can do less and feel more, and that, in a world addicted to acceleration, is a revolution. This kind of life is not seen on social media. It is not sold in workshops. It has no formula, but it transforms from within. It seeks not applause, but truth. It does not accumulate trophies, but cultivates peace. And when you learn to live like this, you don't need great external changes, because the most important thing is already changed, the way you are with yourself. So if today you find yourself creating from another place, serving without draining yourself, expressing yourself without a mask, enjoying simplicity, walking slower, listening to your body, caring for your energy, you are not lost. You are closer to yourself than ever before. And that, even if it doesn't look like success, is the greatest sign of spiritual maturity. Because ultimately, living from the deep self is not changing your life. It is changing your center. And from there, everything becomes more authentic, more essential, more you, after going to collapse of the ego, the sacred pause, the birth of the authentic self, and the reconnection with simplicity. An even subtler but profoundly revealing stage arrives. A stage in which you discover that motivation has not disappeared. It's simply stopped shouting. That not everything is silent, as you thought, but that the frequency has changed. What once felt like a bright, visible flame is now an internal ember, softer, more discreet, but also more stable, more true. The inner world begins to vibrate differently. There is no longer that explosive enthusiasm that pushed you to immediate action, that desire to start 1,000 things without finishing any, that urgency to move even without knowing where to. Now what you feel is more like a whisper, a faint call, a sensation you cannot explain, but know is there, as if something inside you said, there is still a way, but it will no longer be like before. That is the new motivation, an internal call, not a goal, not a need, not a duty. It's as if your soul is speaking to you in an older, deeper, more intimate language. But of course, to hear it, you need something we find hard to practice. Trust in the new rhythm. Because the mind still seeks the previous drive. It wants immediate clarity. It wants firm direction. It wants visible results. And this new frequency does not fit those parameters. This new motivation does not shout, do it now. It doesn't push you to run. It doesn't demand proof. On the contrary, it invites you to wait, to listen, to act when you are aligned, not before. And that, for a mind used to speed and control, can seem like inactivity, but it is not. It is a re-education of impulse. Mario Alonso Puig explains it with simple and powerful words. True does not come from pressure, but from inner clarity. And that clarity does not always appear as a sharp image. Sometimes it is barely a feeling of this yes, without knowing why, an internal assent that needs no arguments. A yes born from coherence, not obligation. Living from this kind of motivation requires trust, a trust that does not rely on data, projections, or statistics, a trust that is built inward, not outward. And that can be scary, because it forces you to let go of the need for everything to have form before taking a step. It forces you to stop seeking guarantees. It forces you to act from what you feel is true, even if you don't know if it will work. This is where many people stop, because they believe that without complete clarity, they cannot move forward. But complete clarity rarely comes. What arrives is a moment of alignment, a moment when body, mind, and soul meet at the same point. And if you act from there, whatever you do will be right, even if the outcome is not what you expected. This new rhythm is slower, softer, more intimate, and because of that, it is often imperceptible if you're not paying attention. If you keep expecting your motivation to sound like before, you will think something is wrong. But it's not wrong. It's just different. And if you learn to read these new codes, you will discover a way of living much more in tune with yourself. Willpower, as Puig describes it, is not a forceful energy. It is an inner response activated when there is coherence. You don't need to convince yourself to act. You only need to listen for when the moment is right. And for that, you must be present. You must inhabit the body. You must recognize when the impulse arises from the center, not from noise. This kind of motivation does not appear in grand speeches. It appears in moments of pause, in a deep breath, in a word that resonates, in a walk where thoughts settle on their own, in a silence that suddenly fills with meaning. And when it appears, you don't feel it as an explosion, but as a certainty, as a direction that doesn't drag you but accompanies you. But trusting that direction implies letting go of many of the structures that sustained your previous action. It means stopping planning every step with precision. It means accepting that sometimes you won't know what comes next, that you will act without a map, that you will move forward with only a lit flashlight inside you, and that, although it seems risky, is actually safer than continuing to repeat patterns that no longer represent you. Because when you follow that new rhythm, even without external certainties, everything inside you settles. Because you are living from your truth. Because you are not betraying yourself to meet others' expectations. Because you are not faking enthusiasm where there is none. Because you allow yourself to wait, listen, and trust. And from there, the movement that arises is not just action, it is expression. The inner clarity Mario speaks of is not a clear idea. It is a state, a balance point between your feeling, thinking, and being. And that state is not achieved through effort, but through presence. You don't get it by planning, but by recognizing. And for that, you need time. You need silence. You need rest. Because only in the pause can the internal antenna that picks up true direction be tuned. Not everything is silent. You are just learning to hear differently. And in that learning, a new life unfolds. A life where your acts do not seek to fill voids, but to express fullness. A life where you no longer need daily motivation, because your way of living is already aligned with who you are. A life where, even without hurry, there is direction. And even without spectacular goals, there is meaning. And even if you don't have a script, you have a compass. A compass that does not point to traditional success, visible achievement, or recognition. It points to you, to your center, to that place inside you where motivation does not run out, because it depends on nothing external, because it simply is, because it simply reminds you, gently, who you are when you stop running. One of the subtlest challenges of this stage is learning to distinguish where the impulse that moves you originates. Because although you no longer act from previous patterns, the ego does not disappear entirely. It changes shape. It learns to disguise itself. And if you're not careful, it can make you believe you're following the soul, when in reality you're returning to the old script. That is why, beyond the silence and the new rhythm, there is a skill that becomes indispensable. To differentiate the impulse of the soul from the impulse of the ego. Mario Alonso Puig argues that the ego is not the enemy, but it is a structure that needs clear boundaries. The ego seeks identity, security, approval. It is fast, anxious, demanding. The soul, on the other hand, seeks coherence, truth, expansion. It is slow, steady, silent. The ego pushes. The soul invites. How do you know where you are acting from? There are clear signs if you learn to listen honestly. When the impulse comes from the ego, there is pressure, there is urgency, there is a need for results. The mind revolves around how you will be seen, what you will achieve, what you would lose if you don't act. There is a voice telling you, take advantage before it's too late. Prove you can, that you are worthy, that you measure up. Even if the action seems noble, deep down there is anxiety, restlessness, dependence. In contrast, when the impulse comes from the soul, there is no rush. There is an active calm, a pressure-free certainty, an energy that does not demand but magnetizes you. The mind is not focused on rewards, but on authenticity. Instead of asking yourself, how will I look? You ask, does this represent me? And although you may be afraid, it is not a paralyzing fear. It is a sacred vertigo. the kind that comes from leaving the known to enter something truer. Mario expresses it this way: authentic action is not reaction, it is manifestation. And that completely changes how you move through life, because you no longer respond automatically. You no longer do things to fill a space. You do what arises from your truth, even if it is small, even if it is not understood. You act not because you must, but because something inside you knows it is right, even if you cannot fully explain it. This difference is also felt in the body. The ego's impulse often generates tension, fatigue, rigidity. The soul's impulse generates expansion, lightness, presence. It's not that it doesn't require effort, but effort is not a struggle. It is surrender, a surrender that energizes you, not drains you. And here appears a concept that may sound paradoxical, but holds a great truth. The new motivation does not push, it attracts. In previous stages of your life, you push yourself, you force yourself, you demanded from yourself. You needed willpower to start, to persist, to not stop. You lived with the idea that without discipline you would achieve nothing. And in part, that was true. But that discipline was often in service of an image, not a truth. Now, in this new frequency, it's not about forcing yourself. It's about allowing. It's about being so coherent with yourself that what you need arrives on its own, not because you are passive, but because you are aligned. And alignment is magnetic. When you live from the deep self, you start attracting what resonates with you. You don't chase it. You don't manipulate it. You don't calculate it. You attract it because your vibration is your new language. That attraction is not magical. It is coherent. When you are at peace with yourself, you make different decisions. You choose different relationships. You accept different jobs. You position yourself differently in the world. And all that generates resonance, a wave that brings back what is in tune with your new level of consciousness. And then something that was once a burden becomes impulse, because purpose is no longer a distant goal, nor an overwhelming expectation. It is no longer something you have to discover outside. It is no longer something someone has to grant you. Purpose, at this stage, becomes a natural expression of your being. It is no longer a weight, but an expansion. Puig says that true purpose is not a mission, but an internal coherence that manifests in everything you do. It is not a big task complete, but a way of living that leaves a mark. Purpose is not something you do. It is something you emanate. And when you understand this, you are freed from the pressure of having to find your purpose, because you no longer seek it as an answer. You allow it as a consequence. Living with purpose from this place is as simple as being yourself in every act. It is speaking from what you believe, choosing from what you feel, walking with awareness, listening with presence, loving without strategies. It is having the courage to be yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's not profitable, even when the world doesn't understand. And curiously, when you align like this, everything begins to flow with less effort. Not because life becomes perfect, but because you are no longer at war with it, because you are no longer trying to fit in. You are no longer trying to be someone else. You are no longer carrying a disguise. You are being, and that, although it may seem subtle, is the most revolutionary thing you can do, because a person who lives from their true purpose doesn't need to shout it out. They don't need to convince. Their mere presence transforms. The very way they exist in the world creates movement, not because of what they say, but because of how they vibrate, because what they do is consistent with who they are. And that coherence is felt. It is recognized. It spreads. So, when you wonder if you're living from the soul or from the ego, if you are connected or disconnected, if you are aligned or repeating patterns, don't look for answers in the noise. Look for the signal in stillness, in the quality of your energy, in how your body responds, in how time feels, in the peace that exists even when things are not easy. The new motivation doesn't push you to do more. It invites you to be more you. And when you are you, everything you do has purpose, not because it is big, not because it is perfect, but because it is true. And the true, even in silence, always leaves light. There is a moment on the path of every soul that decides to awaken when it's no longer about knowing more, having all the answers, or accumulating theories. It's about looking back and recognizing with compassion everything that has been released, everything that has hurt, everything that has changed, and also everything that has been born in that silence where it seemed there was nothing left. Because yes, at first it seems that spiritual awakening leaves you without motivation. It takes you out of urgency, artificial enthusiasm, constant pushing. It takes away what sustained you, but only to return you to yourself. Because you didn't lose a fire, you just stopped feeding it with someone else's wood. Because you're not stuck, you're coming home. And the journey back has no instructions. It is made with pause, presence, courage. You went through the phase where everything seemed to fit, and then, without warning, silence came. Emptiness, disorientation. You no longer knew how to move. The old logic no longer served you. And there began the real process. The collapse of the ego that could no longer organize your identity. The mask started to fall, the characters blurred, and the discomfort of not knowing who you were appeared. Then came that sacred pause, that intermediate territory where you were neither in the past nor the future, only in the now, with its ambiguity, its mystery, its apparent inertia. And there you learned something fundamental. You weren't stuck, you were integrating. You were letting what was lived become part of you in a new way. You began to understand that there is a deeper rhythm that only reveals itself when you stop running. And in that rhythm, the authentic self emerged, not as an improved version of you, but as your naked truth. You no longer want to compete, to please, to gratify. You wanted to live from the center, from your coherence, from a voice that doesn't need to raise its volume because it is not seeking attention. It is only seeking truth, ambition transformed. What once drove you ceased to do so. It was no longer enough to achieve things if they were not aligned with you. And you discovered that it's not about stopping creating, but creating from another place, from inspiration, from genuine service, from authenticity. No longer from obligation or fear, but from the soul. You learned to live from the deep self, to listen to the body as an antenna, to value rest, pause, subtlety, to find joy in simplicity, to allow yourself to breathe without expectations, and to let silence be not emptiness, but fertile space where a new way of being begins to grow. And just when it seemed nothing would move anymore, the new motivation appeared, not as an explosion, but as a call, a new frequency, softer, deeper, more real, an impulse that doesn't push, but attracts, a will that doesn't impose, but reveals itself when you are ready, when you are clear, when you are home with yourself. You discover that you don't need to find a purpose, as if it were a burden you must carry. Purpose is your natural expression when you are you. When you act from your truth, you are already fulfilling your purpose. You don't need big words or big achievements. You only need to be coherent with who you are now. And in the middle of all this process, you understood that nothing is wrong with you, that you are not broken, that you are not losing your way. You are ceasing to live from what you are not. You are letting your soul take the lead. And that doesn't feel like immediate success. It feels like surrender, like a serene yielding, like a new way of living. If you've made it this far, if you felt that this journey represents you, if at any moment you saw yourself reflected in any of these stages, I want to take away one certainty. Everything you're feeling is valid. The silence, the pause, the discomfort, the vertigo, the calm, the lack of motivation, the desire to let go, the need to start over, all of that is part of the awakening. You are not failing. You are blossoming in a different way. And blossoming is not always visible from the outside. Sometimes it happens deep within, in the invisible, in the way you decide to return to yourself again and again, in how you choose not to betray yourself, even if no one sees it, in how you hold your truth without having to shout it out loud. Before I say goodbye, I want to leave you with one last invitation. If this video resonated with you, if you felt you are not alone in this process, if something inside you calmed down by hearing it, share it with someone who needs it. It could be that friend going through a strange stage, that person who feels lost after awakening, someone who doesn't know how to explain it. This message could be a light for their night. And if you want to keep supporting this kind of content, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and leave your comment below. This space is built by all of us, and every word, every story, every shared experience strengthens us. And now, to close, if you made it to the end and want to receive a special greeting in the next video, comment below the word harmony, that word that represents the new state where there's no need to run, only to vibrate in coherence with who you are. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you, above all, for having the courage to awaken and keep walking. See you very soon.